It was 2020, during the peak of the pandemic, when everything in the world felt off balance. I was 21, stuck in my small town with no real job prospects. I ended up at McDonald's, working the night shift because, honestly, what else was there to do? The hours were terrible, but at least it paid the bills. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Maybe I should have stayed silent. Maybe it would have been better for me. But here I am, spilling it all because I can't forget what happened. I should have known something was wrong from the very first night I worked there. It's the little things, the weird rules that no one talks about outright, but everyone knows to follow. Rules that you dare not break if you want to make it through the night. One of the first things the manager told me was, never look at the drive-through camera. Sounds like a joke, right? But I learned quick it wasn't. One night, I was just doing my usual, making fries, wiping down the counters. Then I caught myself staring at the little camera screen above the drive-through window. I didn't think much of it, but the second I looked, I saw it. The car at the window, a plain, regular sedan. But something wasn't right. The guy in the driver's seat wasn't blinking. Not once. He just stared straight ahead. His eyes were wrong, like they were frozen in place. I snapped out of it and turned away. But when I glanced back at the camera, he was gone. I didn't even hear the car leave. That should have been my warning. But I brushed it off, like everyone else does. Maybe it was nothing. Then came the meat grinder. There's a locked room in the back of the store. Has been ever since I started working there. It's got this big old meat grinder. I'd always assumed it was just part of the kitchen equipment, but one night, the manager pulled me aside after a shift and warned me with this cold stare. She said, "Never go near the meat grinder. It's off limits." I didn't ask why. You learn not to ask why. I used to be curious, but curiosity gets you nowhere here. That rule should have been the easiest to follow, but I didn't. I was standing there, cleaning the back room one night, when I noticed the door to the meat room was slightly open. I figured, whatever, the manager must have forgotten to lock it. I went in. The room was cold, the air thick with the smell of something wrong, like iron. The meat grinder was on, humming softly. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the machine. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard her voice, sharp and panicked. "Don't touch anything in here." I never went near it again. The third rule was simple. No customers after 10 p.m. This one's easy, right? You lock the door, turn off the lights, and that's it. But sometimes people still show up. And when they do, you're not supposed to let them in. One night, a guy in a dirty suit showed up just as I was locking up. I was about to tell him to leave, but before I could, he knocked on the window. His eyes, those same eyes, like they weren't human, looked through me. His hand was on the door before I even thought to lock it. I hesitated. I should have turned him away, but I didn't. I unlocked it, let him in. The moment he stepped inside, the air turned cold. The kitchen lights flickered. The hum of the fryers was the only sound. He didn't order anything, just stood there, staring at the counter like he was waiting for something. I turned my back to grab a rag, and when I turned back, he was gone. It's like he disappeared into thin air. There was a trail of ice on the floor where he'd stood, and I swear, I heard the sound of a grinder in the back. But when I went back, the room was empty. There was nothing. I started to notice the boxes, those white frozen boxes that were delivered every week. You're not supposed to ask where they come from, just what's inside. They're always cold as ice, and when you open them, there's this weird smell. I've seen what's inside a couple of times, but I never said anything. You don't. You never do. The rules are there for a reason. Rule number 5. Always serve the special meal on Wednesdays. It's this big order, always the same. 2 Big Macs, 20 nuggets, fries, sodas. It comes through the drive-thru every Wednesday night, no exceptions. The weird part? You never see the person. They never come to the window. But you have to serve it anyway, no questions asked. And after they drive off, the parking lot always looks emptier, like there's something in the air, something darker that follows them. I didn't think it meant anything until I saw the blood stain. It wasn't from the kitchen, I know that much. I don't know what happened, but the blood was fresh. It covered the seat of the car, and when I tried to follow up on it, the manager told me not to. She said, "Don't ask about the special orders. Just keep serving them." I used to think the weirdness was just the pandemic messing with my head. People had been acting strange, sure. But this was something different. There's one rule I haven't mentioned yet. I broke it the other day. I shouldn't have, but I did. The rule was simple. Never talk to the delivery driver. He pulls up at 2 a.m. every night, unloading black boxes from a truck. I never really cared where they came from, until the night I asked him where they were from. He stopped, stared at me, and I could feel his eyes burning into me. Then, in a voice that didn't sound human, he said, "You'll find out soon enough." That's the thing about this place. It gets to you. The rules, the weirdness. You're stuck, just like everyone else, just like I am now. And if you're not careful, if you break the rules just once, you'll disappear too. I didn't think much of the delivery driver's words, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My gut was screaming at me. It was like the whole place was suffocating me, and I couldn't breathe. The clock ticked past midnight, and I was working the counter, trying to stay busy. Then it happened. The bell above the door rang, and a customer walked in. I froze. He was the kind of guy you don't forget. Tall, thin, with dark, hollow eyes. He wore an old leather jacket, but it was too big for him, and there was something wrong about the way he walked. He wasn't limping or stumbling, but there was something off about his movements. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. "The special meal?" I felt the blood drain from my face. No one should know about that. I should have told him to leave. I should have kicked him out. But I didn't. Something in his eyes, something like an old desperate pain, made me want to help him, or at least not to anger him. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding strange, as if someone else were speaking for me. "It's true, but you're not supposed to..." Before I could finish, he smiled, and it wasn't a smile. It was an unholy grin. His teeth were too sharp, too white, like he had never eaten a real meal in his life. He pointed to the counter, to the fryer, then to the back. "You don't know what you've done, do you?" I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. He kept talking, his voice low and steady, like he was speaking in riddles. "You're all part of it," he whispered. "You've been feeding the wrong people. And they don't just want food, kid. They want you. All of you." Then he laughed, a low, hollow laugh that made my skin crawl. He turned and walked toward the back room, heading toward the freezer. The freezer we were never supposed to open. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I couldn't. I was frozen. And then, just like that, the kitchen lights flickered. I stood there, breathless, waiting for something to happen. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and the sound of the fryer seemed to grow louder. And then it came, the grinding. It wasn't the usual sound. It was different this time, deep and guttural, like 100 souls were trapped inside. The smell of raw meat hit me like a wall, iron, rancid, sharp. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed the counter to steady myself. I thought I was going crazy. And that's when I heard it. A scream, a woman's scream. It was muffled like it was coming from the freezer. I took a step forward, but before I could get any closer, the back door slammed open. And there he was, the driver, the one who'd warned me earlier. He stood there, looking at me with those empty eyes. "You shouldn't have asked," he said, his voice even colder than the freezer. He didn't have to say anything else. I saw the blood stain, fresh, bright red, dripping from his hands as he stepped aside, revealing the body. It wasn't human anymore. I had broken the rule. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move as the figure in front of me stepped aside to reveal the gruesome sight. The body. It wasn't a person anymore. The flesh had been stripped away in places, leaving only raw, pale muscle and bone. The eyes, those eyes, were wide open, staring at nothing. The skin was torn in jagged, uneven patches, like something had clawed its way out from within. But it wasn't the body that made my stomach twist. It was what was left inside the hollowed-out chest. Something was missing. A lump formed in my throat as I took a hesitant step forward, my feet dragging against the cold concrete floor. The thing on the table, the remains of a woman maybe, or someone else, it was still warm. A fresh crimson pool had already spread beneath her. But what really made my blood run cold was the absence. It was like someone had ripped out her soul and left only the shell behind. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The delivery driver, the one who had warned me earlier, was standing in the doorway, watching me closely, his eyes never leaving mine. "You should have never asked," he repeated, his voice low, almost affectionate. "Now you're part of the process. You're just another piece." Another piece. It hit me then. The special meal wasn't just an order. It wasn't a regular customer. They were feeding someone, something, and I was a part of it. "You didn't know, did you?" The driver chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "The boxes, the meat grinder, the freezer, it's all part of the supply chain. You think you're feeding the customers, but you're really feeding the higher-ups." I felt my stomach churn. This wasn't a regular McDonald's. This was a slaughterhouse. But it wasn't just meat they were processing. It was people. The woman on the table wasn't the first. And I knew that now, with a sickening certainty that twisted my insides. The rules, the ones I had blindly followed, they weren't there to protect us. They were there to protect them. "Don't worry," the driver said with a twisted smile. "It's your turn soon enough." I didn't have time to process what he meant before the door to the back slammed open with a force that shook the entire building. A voice, familiar but wrong, echoed from the kitchen. "Where's the next batch?" I turned, my blood running cold, as I saw the manager standing there, her face pale and stretched too thin. Her lips twitched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You didn't follow the rules," she said, her voice dripping with something like satisfaction. "Now you're part of the product." The grinding started again, louder this time, deafening. I could barely hear my own thoughts as I turned to run. I had to get out, but I didn't make it far. A sharp pain shot through my leg as someone, gripped my ankle. I looked down and saw the woman's severed hand, fingers twitching as it dragged me back toward the table. The delivery driver chuckled again, and I realized too late that it wasn't the special meal they were serving. It was us, and no one ever leaves. I struggled, my body fighting against the cold, clammy hand gripping my ankle. I kicked and twisted, but it only pulled me closer to the table where the woman's mutilated body lay. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gasped for breath, but the air felt thicker, suffocating. The lights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The manager took a slow step forward, her smile widening as she surveyed my fear. "You're too late," she whispered. "We already have everything we need." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, the air pressing down on me like a weight. Then I saw something. A flash of movement in the corner of my eye. The meat grinder. It was running again, louder than before. But it wasn't just the usual meat. Something was inside it. I turned my head. my stomach lurching as the pale flesh of the woman's dismembered body parts slowly started to shift and twist in the grinder, reforming into something grotesque and horrifying. The limbs seemed to come alive, rearranging into a new, unnatural shape. The skin stretched, and the bones cracked, as though the pieces were reassembling themselves into something that had no place in this world. I tried to pull myself away, but the hand still gripped me, dragging me toward the table. The air was thick with the smell of blood and rot, and I felt my skin crawl. "Please stop," I gasped, my voice hoarse. I didn't know. The manager chuckled. "You all say that, but it doesn't matter now. You're a part of the process, just like the others. You'll make the perfect ingredient." Her voice was like a cold whisper in my ear, and I looked up, my eyes wide with terror. The delivery driver was standing by the door, his eyes fixed on me with that same hollow stare. He wasn't just a driver. He was part of it all. He was one of them. But there was something I didn't expect. A loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone else was here. The manager froze, her eyes darting toward the door. And then he walked in. It was me. But it wasn't. Not exactly. This version of me was pale, sickly, and covered in dark bruises. His eyes were wide and glassy, like he'd been staring at something far too long. The smell of decay clung to him, and his clothes were tattered, like he'd been through hell. He looked down at me, his lips twitching into a twisted smile. "You didn't think they'd let you get away, did you?" The voice that came from his mouth was mine, but wrong. It was empty, lifeless. I tried to back away, but the hand was still clutching my ankle, dragging me toward the table. The other me stepped closer, his dead eyes locking with mine. "You should have followed the rules," he murmured. "Now you're part of the family." I wanted to scream, to run, but it was too late. My body felt heavy, and my vision blurred. The last thing I saw before the darkness took over was the meat grinder, grinding away, spinning out something that wasn't human anymore. And I realized, with horrifying clarity, that there would never be an end. This was my new reality. I had become the product.